Welcome students to today's video. Today we will be discussing the Enlightenment. Now this can seem like a complex topic, but really we're going to simplify it and go through a couple key figures. The Enlightenment is just a time period that stressed reason, thought, and the power of the individual to solve problems. So it's really simple. People could think of how to solve problems and then they solved problems. They used rational thought and came up with a way to solve a problem that just made sense. This was heavily influenced by the style of reasoning used by Socrates. That was the picture you saw in the intro. That was Socrates. He's an ancient Greek philosopher, and you probably learned about him last year. Our first guy that we're going to look at is Thomas Hobbes, and we've talked about him a little bit. If you're not sure who he is or what he believes, go back and watch the other video that compares Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. Here is the lowdown on Thomas Hobbes. He wrote a book named Leviathan, and in that book he discusses the role of government and comes to the conclusion that people really are bad at heart and we need somebody with complete power to protect us. So the best government was one that had complete power to protect people from their destructive nature. His view was that people were so bad they couldn't be trusted and that they have no rights to revolution. They have no rights to complain about the government if the government is keeping their best interest in mind. Now what this assumes is that people are naturally bad, but the leader that's going to rule them is going to be naturally good. This doesn't always happen. We're going to get into why he thought this a little bit later. The next guy, John Locke. He's also an English philosopher. A lot of times we see his ideas completely clash with Thomas Hobbes. The big thing with John Locke are natural rights. Here's a quote from him. Men are born free and equal with three natural rights: life, liberty, property. Those are the three rights that he believed that every person was born with. Now, notice his terminology. He uses men. We're going to get into this inequality whenever we look at another female Enlightenment thinker. But there definitely was an inequality with men and women. And when it comes down to it, a lot of the people that used men are all born free really meant a certain group of men. Here is the place of government according to John Locke. The government's job is to protect the rights. And if they fail to protect those natural rights, then the people have a right to overthrow the government, to replace it. This should sound a little bit familiar. We're going to look at this document, Declaration of Independence. This is just a small section of it, but I've highlighted some words that really pop out and stand out to what John Locke was saying. Thomas Jefferson was heavily influenced by the Enlightenment movement, and he used a lot of the ideas and combined them really into this Declaration of Independence. I mean, the first word that I've put in red is self-evident. So these things are self-aware. We can see these things ourselves. We don't need anybody to tell us. And that we have unalienable rights, rights that can't be revoked. You're born with these rights. You can't lose them because you're born with them. And this is where he differs a little bit from John Locke. He uses life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as his three unalienable rights, rights that you're born with. And then he gets into the role of government, to secure the rights, and that governments are instituted among men. So we institute the government to secure those rights, and that the government actually gets its power from the people, from the consent of the governed. So Thomas Jefferson was definitely heavily influenced by John Locke when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. This is how we can tie it into the importance of our life today. In fact, a lot of the people we're going to look at, their ideas were directly taken from them and put into our U.S. Constitution. These are the 5 core beliefs of most of the Enlightenment thinkers. Number 1, reason. Believing that truth could be obtained through reason/logical thinking. Number 2, nature. What is natural is also good and reasonable. There's going to be a big focus on the natural world and explaining nature, not just believing the religious viewpoint of nature. Number 3, happiness. This is a big takeoff from earlier periods of time. They claim that people should stop trying to seek happiness in the afterlife, but focus on being happy on earth. So focus on this life. Don't focus on the afterlife, but focus on this life. Number 4, progress. The idea that society and humankind could improve, which is a big deal. It's a big deal to actually believe that society could solve its own problems and that life could actually improve. Number 5, liberty. Pursued freedom and rights for ordinary people that had never had them before. These people in Europe are used to somebody telling them every little thing to do. They're used to an absolute monarch. And they're not used to the idea of personal freedoms or personal rights. But this is going to play in big to this Enlightenment movement because it sounds really good. It sounds really good for me if I'm from a lower class to believe that I am equal to somebody of a higher class than me, and that I have certain rights that are the same as them that can't be questioned. The next person we're going to look at is Montesquieu. I know his name can kind of seem hard to pronounce, but it's pretty simple. Spelling it's a different story, but think mosquito. It's kind of the same thing. So Montesquieu. He wrote Spirit of the Laws in 1748, and his big idea was that the government shouldn't be in one person. Power should be separated out into 3 branches. And the branches should be a legislative power to make laws, an executive power to carry out laws, and the judicial power to interpret the law. We use this in the United States. The legislative power is our U.S. Congress. They make all the laws. The executive power is the president. He carries out the laws. He can choose how to enforce the laws. Now notice, he cannot directly make laws. Congress has to do that. And then the judicial power is our Supreme Court and our court system. They interpret the laws that Congress makes to really make sure that they don't infringe on anybody's rights. They don't go against the rights in the Constitution that are guaranteed to all citizens. Then we have this guy, Rousseau. Rousseau's famous quote is, "Man is born free and everywhere he is in chains," because he lives in a time period when he sees absolute monarchs that are really corrupt and just put the people down. He believed that government should be formed and guided by the general will of society. So what this boils down to is that people should be elected to serve the general will of the people. Now, this is kind of a direct democracy. We're not going to get into direct, indirect democracy, but just know that this is a type of democracy that he's describing. Then we have Voltaire. Voltaire is also French. Here's a quote from him: "I do not agree with a word you say, but will defend to the death your right to say it." In this quote, he's explaining freedom of speech. And in many of his writings, he criticized the government and expressed that really these 4 things, tolerance, reason, freedom of religion, and freedom of speech, had to be implemented. They had to come out of the government. That really this was the best thing for the people. If you notice, a lot of these things end up being in our Bill of Rights. So we borrowed heavily from Voltaire really to make our Bill of Rights, especially the First Amendment when we're talking about freedom of religion and freedom of speech. Then we get to our final woman. She is the only woman we'll discuss in the Enlightenment. And really we see that with this woman in particular, she fought some injustices of her time. She wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792, which really challenged the inequalities of men and women in life. She saw that men definitely didn't treat women equally and didn't see them as equals. In fact, most women were considered less intelligent than men at the time, even though it wasn't true. And she also said that women need education to become virtuous and useful. So really it's a big push, not just for women to have education, but for all people to have equal access to education. A lot of people use her writings really to push women's rights and see some equality for men and women, but also for different cultures and races to be equally educated. Now, here's this lasting legacy. Number 1, a belief in progress, that actually believing that humanity could solve social problems, and that we had a right and duty to do that, not just to sit back and let bad things happen. Number 2, a secular outlook, not looking to the church for all knowledge. This started to break away with the Protestant Reformation, but it continued during this time of Enlightenment, and people were starting to be able to understand nature a little bit more using science, scientific reasoning, to try to solve problems that they saw and explain nature. So secular is going to be a worldly outlook, not a church outlook, but worldly. Number 3, the importance of the individual. So the individual became very, very important in this time, and that you had to look to yourself for knowledge and guidance, not rely on somebody else. The individual was a very important person. So now we get to the big question. Why were there so many writers focused on improving government during the 1700s? And I've got 3 examples. We've got Louis XIV of France, which started a tradition of absolute monarchs. Louis XV, which carried on his father's traditions and really oppressed his people and used them pretty much for his pleasure. He got money from them and spent it like nobody's business. And then finally, Louis XVI, the last absolute monarch of France. He, unfortunately, was the product of his father and grandfather and did similar things to oppress the people. But you got to imagine this started in the 1500s and ended in the 1700s. There were a lot of issues with government, and there was a lot of distrust of government. So during this time, really people started to come up with better ways to do things instead of just going along with tradition. So that's really why people focused on improving government. There were a lot of things that needed to be improved. One person was proven not to work because that person could be easily corrupted. So we're going to look at some other reasons of why political thought was so important in the Enlightenment. But for now, you can look at these 3 guys as a prime example of why so many focused on improving government. Anyway, I hope this video helped explain the Enlightenment a little bit better, and thank you for watching.